This video covers the following themes. Viewer discretion is advised.
What you're seeing on screen is the video that changed internet horror forever. This is Introduction, the first part in a series of videos that would later be known as Marble Hornets. Marble Hornets is one of the most prestigious horror projects in the history of online fiction. A multimedia web series spanning across 2 YouTube channels and a roleplay account on Twitter, it tells the tale of a young man named Jay who participated in a failed student film called, well, Marble Hornets. After being given the project tapes by former college mate Alex with instructions to burn them, Jay takes it upon himself to sift through the film's contents. But after Jay begins to find strange anomalies, it becomes more and more apparent that a dark entity has set its sight on the filmmakers. Marble Hornets is widely considered to be one of the last pioneers of unfiction, a form of storytelling where the events being depicted are treated as though they're real. It played a hand in popularizing the analog tape aesthetic, and the visuals were far more scary than most found footage films that were made around its time. But despite all the accolades and the incredible presentation, the story of Marble Hornets is hardly unique. A key detail which I've left out until now is that Marble Hornets is the first video adaptation of a creepypasta monster known as the Slender Man. Created by Victor Surge on the Something Awful forums as part of a paranormal image contest, the Slender Man is an urban legend that was stitched together by the internet over the course of days. While Victor created the design and premise, it was the works produced by the burgeoning creepypasta community that solidified many of the lore and tropes of the Slender Man. In my video discussing the rise and fall of Jeff the Killer, I described how I and many others growing up at the time thought that these stories were real urban legends. This sort of online kayfabe, combined with the many projects that surrounded the character, propelled old Slendy Boy into not just internet fame, but mainstream pop culture. If you were growing up during 2012, there was no avoiding him. He was in video games, Let's Play videos, music videos, Minecraft, fucking Smosh? But it goes deeper than that. If you were to produce a list of all the different projects that contained elements borrowed from these stories, it would form a massive web of connections. And that right there is what I'm interested in exploring today. In this video, we're going to cover the massive legacy of the Slender Man, along with Marble Hornets and Slender the 8 Pages. We'll go over the inspirations that went into these creations, tackle the different adaptations of each of these, and sift through many pieces of media that touched shoulders with the Slender Man phenomenon. And by the end of this video, we'll hopefully come away with a newfound appreciation for the Slender Man, figure out why this character has been difficult to revitalize, and discuss what the future might hold for old Slendy Boy. So without further ado, let's... Look, what is this?
I'm the guy you hired on Craigslist to record this.
Who?
You said you needed someone on camera to dub your voiceover with.
Oh, you're him? My god, you're a lot shorter in person.
Am I getting paid for this or what?
Oh, don't worry, I got you. The gap in time between Victor's original images and the start of Marble Hornets was incredibly short. The web series began only 10 days after the Something Awful image contest, and it even managed to beat all the real sighting videos to the punch. However, Marble Hornets was far from the de facto version of the Slender Man at this time. This is sort of a misconception, but around the beginning of 2010, Marble Hornets and its version of the Slender Man, known as the Operator, was only one of many adaptations. The Slender Man was still an underground phenomenon, and his background was fairly malleable since the creepypasta fandom was but a twinkle in Jeff the Killer's eye. Aside from Marble Hornets and its copycats, there were quite a few other stories between 2009 and 2011 that featured the character. Just Another Fool is a story told in the form of a blog site that centers on the contents of a journal which belonged to a soldier named Matt. What really sticks out to me about this story are the doodles featured in the journal. Aside from Marble Hornets, it's one of the earliest examples of notebook pages being a relevant part of the Slender Man mythos, and I wouldn't be shocked if it inspired the page hunting mechanic in Slender the 8 Pages. On top of that, Where the Rivers Join, along with Tall, Thin, and Faceless, were also pretty iconic creepypastas, and they each followed a rather similar premise. Both of these stories involve the disappearance of a close friend or family member who was taken away by the Slender Man. And while the horror in the first story is kept pretty subtle, the events of the latter story are so insane that it results in the protagonist being locked up inside of an insane asylum. Tall, Thin, and Faceless makes great use of its unreliable narrator, and by the end of the story you're left wondering what the fuck is going on. Is he just crazy, or is the Slender Man some kind of parasite that jumps between people and assimilates them? The ending of the story almost reminds me of He Comes, which is a Zalgo creepypasta that details the gradual assimilation of an entire town. It's incredibly open-ended. So as you can see, the Slender Man from his very inception was always a blank canvas. While none of this should discredit the work that Victor put into the design and concept of his monster, it doesn't change the fact that the collective mythos he's known for is a product of the internet. The fact remains that the Slender Man has always been a fertile breeding ground for up-and-coming artists, and no more was this apparent than with Marble Hornets. Much has been said about Marble Hornets over the last 16 years now, and it's easily the greatest thing to ever come out of the state of Alabama. If you're here for a full breakdown of the story though, you should go check out Nightmind's analysis instead. I'm just not interested in doing that in this video. Sorry, not sorry. Rather, I want to focus on the tropes and visual elements present in Marble Hornets that help to define not just future Slender Man projects, but internet horror for over a decade. The first element is the damaged analog aesthetic. It goes without saying that Marble Hornets borrows heavily from found footage horror like the Blair Witch Project. But the introduction of video and audio glitches was something wholly unique to this series. This was mentioned in both Alex Harris' Slender Man documentary and in the audio commentary tracks in the Marble Hornets DVD releases. But essentially, the team didn't want the operator to make noises or really move at all when he was on camera. So, to solve this problem, they introduced the camera glitches as a way for him to move on screen and make spooky noises without actually doing anything. This design choice is pretty much stuck with each iteration of the Slender Man going forward, and it's a visual aesthetic that would later carry into the analog horror genre. Secondly, there's the multiple forms of media. The videos on the Marble Hornets channel were designed to look like something that could have been made in Windows Movie Maker, despite the fact that the series was edited in Sony Vegas. It's a style of editing designed to mimic early online content from the 2000s, and much like the ripped gameplay footage seen in projects such as Ben Drowned, the amateur look added to the believability of the story being told. But Marble Hornets is only part of the full picture. To the Arc was a supplemental channel that ran alongside the main story. It was hosted by one of the proxies that worked alongside the operator, and its content consisted mostly of cryptic messages and codes that had to be deciphered by the community. Each of these channels, along with their editing styles, would go on to greatly influence future horror projects, as well as scare viewers for decades to come. The last major element I want to focus on is the incredibly low budget. This was initially done out of necessity since the team consisted of just a few guys with a camera. But even as the series grew in popularity, the team made it a point to keep their current design process. What I think this decision reinforced was that anyone with a camera, a computer, and an artistic vision could go out and do the same thing as them. It was a form of horror that was easily accessible, and it helped shine a light on the creepypasta phenomenon as a whole. Marble Hornets, alongside Ben Drowned, essentially became the bedrock for horror on the internet. And if you're curious at all about my thoughts on Ben Drowned, you can find the link to that video in the pinned comment. However, the works that spawned from Marble Hornets aren't anything to sneeze at either. Clear Lakes 44, which was designed initially as a sequel, was an early pioneer of the analog horror genre. Alongside its sister series ECVA, Clear Lakes 44 sets out with the goal to expand upon the world building of Marble Hornets. The series is told through CCTV footage courtesy of Clear Lakes Communications, and it primarily follows the character known as the Birdwatcher. The special effects in the series are honestly in a league of its own, and despite its unfortunate cancellation, it's genuinely the most creative part of the Marble Hornets universe. Speaking of sequels, Marble Hornets Rosswood is a multi-part special that was released over a decade after the original series. This video won't really be discussing Rosswood in much detail, but it seems to be set in an alternate universe where Alex and Jay never encountered the operator until their mid-30s or so. It feels very reminiscent of The Oldest View by Kane Pixels, yet it still retains the spirit of the original Marble Hornets web series. Marble Hornets also spawned a movie and a comic book. Always Watches, a Marble Hornets story, is a direct-to-video release that follows an unrelated group of adults who are being stalked by the operator. For as much as this film does wrong, I genuinely think that a lot of the hate it gets is just a smidge undeserved. It's a below-average film at its worst, and while the story and characters are pretty dumb, I do like the cinematography. The Marble Hornets comic, however, is pretty interesting. The story takes place after the events of the web series, and the events are 100% canon. It follows Jessica Locke, the girl from season 2 and 3 of the series, and it reintroduces unused ideas from Marble Hornets such as the Proxy Scully. There's only 4 issues so far of the comic, and the 5th and final issue is slated to come out this November. I would definitely check it out if you have the time. But among all the media that spawned from Marble Hornets, there is one that completely overshadows all of these. And funnily enough, it's not even an official spin-off. You all know what it is. It's time we finally discuss There's a handful of games that are responsible for how online creators make content on the internet today. Obviously, you have Five Nights at Freddy's, a media empire that popularized lore videos on YouTube. There's Fortnite, the ultimate crossover title that catapulted esports to the forefront of mainstream culture. You have Minecraft, a video game with infinite possibilities for content and creativity. And then you have Slender, which basically set the standard for the way gameplay channels must present themselves on screen. Slender the 8 Pages, also known as Slender, was the quintessential survival horror game. There were better games that released prior to it, such as SCP Containment Breach and Amnesia the Dark Descent, and they honestly deserve their own videos on this channel at some point. But Slender alongside Minecraft was what really caused Let's Plays to take off the way they did. Not much is exactly known about the game's production, but if you're curious, you can go and check out the page for it on the cutting room floor. The premise of the game is incredibly simple. You play as a silent woman with a flashlight trekking through the woods in search of 8 pages, and you have to collect them all before you're caught by the titular Slender Man. That's it. That's the entire game. You can collect the pages in whatever order you want, but the game ends either when you die or when all the pages have been found. But despite the basic premise and almost arcade-like objective, people were calling this the scariest game ever made. It became a challenge online to try and finish this game, as well as it further promoted the use of face cams for Let's Play videos, and was a watershed moment for the growth of PewDiePie's channel.
What the fuck? Oh my.
Simply put, Slender the 8 Pages was an utter force of nature that completely warped online culture. But with such insane success also came a lot of imitators. I'm only going to be talking about the ones I either played or watched videos of growing up, because otherwise we would literally be here forever. The first notable example is Slender Man's Shadow, an episodic series of games that were made initially in FPS Maker before being ported to Unity. I've heard differing opinions regarding this series online, but overall they're about the same level of quality as Slender. What I will say is that Markiplier's Let's Plays of these games were among the first videos I ever watched on his channel, and I can't thank this series enough for that. The first clone that I ever played, however, was Slender Rising. It's a mobile game that was made for iPhone devices, and I used to play it quite a bit on my iPod Touch back in high school. The game has a point-and-move control scheme that isn't too dissimilar to early VR games, and aside from the cramped levels, it's honestly a really good attempt at the Slender Man formula. I especially like the look and feel of the daytime level, and I wouldn't be shocked if it's the reason why I enjoy the atmosphere of Silent Hill 2. Another notable game at the time was Stop It Slender. It started its development on Roblox back in 2010, and it shares a lot in common with a game mode of the same name from Gary's Mod in 2013. While both of these are rather impressive, my personal favorite of this is actually a game mode from Halo Reach. If you grew up during the 360 era like I did, then you might just remember the Slender Forge maps. If you don't, there's an old Ninja video in the description you can go and watch. Essentially, you would run around and hide on a Forge map trying to run out the timer, while an invisible player with an energy sword would chase and try to kill all the players on the map. Overall, these games are among the earliest examples of multiplayer survival horror, and for reasons that will become more relevant later, it became a pioneer of a certain gameplay loop that was at the time incredibly rare. But among all the clones, the most notable game to spawn from the success of Slender is its direct sequel, Slender the Arrival. Arrival pulled out all the stops to try and cement itself as the be-all, end-all Slender clone. They even brought on both the Marble Hornets team and Victor Surge to help with this project. And while it's far from a masterpiece, it was still a pretty entertaining game. It's certainly one of my favorite horror games, but I do think that it suffers from the same problems as Layers of Fear. The game is just way too short, it's not always scary, it doesn't really lean enough into the lost footage angle as games like Outlast, and the story is kind of whatever. The highlight of this game for me is definitely the flashback sequence where you're on the farm walking through the bunker. It perfectly nails the Blair Witch vibe that Marble Hornets was going for, and I wish more of the game was like this. All in all, the Slender Man had 4 good years of success, but by the time 2014 rolled around, the character began to experience a natural decline in popularity. As soon as he appeared, he essentially vanished into the background of internet history, never to be seen again. You still have people out there today making Slender Man stories, which we'll get into later, but for the most part, nothing of note has really happened yet aside from an awful movie by Sony Pictures. So now that everyone's caught up to speed, we can finally dive into the meat of this video. Something you have to understand before we get into this is that influence is a cultural phenomenon. Art in a nutshell is about self-expression. So long as you're not an utter hack, your art is ultimately going to be formed by your own knowledge and experience. Because of that, sometimes the elements of an already existing work might make their way into your art, and it may not always be on purpose. So as a result, it's possible to trace elements of your story back to an earlier existing work, and vice versa. We'll be spending a bit going over different works that I believe were influenced by either the Slender Man, Marble Hornets, or Slender the 8 Pages. The goal of this exercise is to feel out the culture produced by this character, and how it may have affected the landscape of horror media. Because the nature of this discussion is kinda subjective, my confidence in these inclusions will be indicated in the top left by a certain number of pages.
That's right, baby, this was secretly an iceberg video all along!
8 pages means that I feel incredibly confident about this inclusion, while a single page means that the claim I'm making is a bit of a stretch. And if an entry is listed as an honorable mention, that means it's just relevant to the discussion at hand. So you got all that? Alright, good. Let's start off then with an easy one. Well, easy may not be the right word for this character. When it comes to stories about the Slender Man, most people who grew up during the height of creepypasta immediately think of Tiki Toby. The character's design and story is just as iconic as Jeff the Killer, and he's got this dorky look to him that a lot of girls seem to gravitate towards. However, part of what separated Toby from all the other Jeff the Killer clones was the influence that the Slender Man mythos had on his story. The character was the usual tortured soul whose life was thrown into a downward spiral by the Slender Man, and the story also popularized the concept of proxies among the creepypasta fandom. That all being said, I do have to note that the character was a hot button topic for a few years, and this is due to the fact that Toby suffers from Tourette's. It's where the Tiki in his name comes from, which obviously looks awful when stripped of its entire context. While I understand how the character can be seen as offensive, I think a lot of the harassment the author Castaway received for his story was kind of unnecessary, and this is for a few reasons. First of all, the story doesn't try to fetishize or vilify his Tourette's. This isn't a Michael Myers situation where he's evil because he's mentally ill or some shit. In fact, his nickname was something given to him by his bullies. It's just a condition the character has, and it gives context for why he's treated horribly in school, since kids can be fucking shitty. Like, for all the crap I gave Clockwork in my Jeff the Killer video, one thing I will praise the story for is that it did an okay job at depicting the life of a social outcast. So the fact that Tiki Toby pulled that off without having to rely on shock value is honestly impressive. Another thing is that his Tourette's aren't treated as a joke. This is a misconception that stems from a lot of the fan art surrounding the character. His personality is a lot more subdued in the actual story, and it's an aspect of his character that was flanderized by members of the creepypasta fandom. But even if you just read between the lines, it's clear to anyone who has actually read this story that the author wasn't trying to offend anyone. I mean, Castaway was 12 when he wrote the original story, and he has since disowned this version of the character. Coupled with the fact that he also made the original art of Tiki Toby, it becomes obvious that the character was just an edgy OC of his. That's also how Clockwork came to be. A lot of the original art was produced by her author. What you have to remember is that this was back in 2013, a time when emo culture was still prominent and fandoms like Sonic the Hedgehog and Homestuck were at their peak. It was just popular at the time for children who participated in these subcultures to have these sort of edgy characters or personas. Nobody was thinking about how their creations would be perceived decades down the line. These were just kids trying to express themselves, which is why these characters feel so authentic despite many of their glaring flaws. Regardless of the past controversies surrounding the character, Tiki Toby is still one of the most important artifacts produced by the creepypasta community. Much like the Slenderverse that spawned from Marble Hornets, which we'll get into later, characters like Tiki Toby, Clockwork, and our old friend Jeffy Boy inspired an entire generation of teens and outcasts to try their hands at creative writing. These stories were far from perfect, Clockwork especially, but they each left their mark on the history of online horror, and I think they deserve to be remembered. On a less heavy note, another notable story that took direct inspiration from the Slender Man is Siren Head. Much like our faceless cryptid, the 40-foot-tall forest-stalking creature began its life as one of many horror edits by Trevor Henderson on Tumblr. Its brief time in the spotlight began in late 2018, and the character is most remembered for two major events. First, the character had a few fan games made of him that Let's Players were quick to jump on. The The most popular is the game made by Modus Interactive for the haunted PS1 Halloween Game Jam. But secondly, the character is also remembered for the way that Trevor handled his newfound internet fame. A lot of time went into trying to reclaim his character out of fear that he'd lose the rights to it. He saw what happened to the Slender Man and didn't want the same thing to happen with his creature. This overreaction ended up killing a lot of the early momentum that the character had built up, and to this day he has yet to make something as successful as Siren Head. Overall, the character today is remembered mostly as a footnote in the history of online horror, sandwiched between the golden age of creepypasta and the beginning of the analog horror explosion. It would probably take another massive project to revitalize interest in Trevor's creatures again, but I imagine that won't happen without his direct involvement. Similarly to Siren Head, the Look-See is another creature that was created in the gap between the two major periods of internet horror. Created by Landon Stalmer for the YouTube channel Crypt TV, the Look-See is one of the channel's many unique horror monsters. Crypt TV is still kicking around these days for anyone who wants to check them out. But as far as this discussion goes, the first Look-See short was released on July 21st, 2017. The character's main gimmick is that it stalks and forcibly steals body parts from people who are themselves refusing to let go of something. This could be a material possession or even just a vice of theirs. Where the Slender Man becomes relevant though is in the design of the Look-See. Both its fans and the Crypt TV staff are well aware of the comparisons between the two characters, although I'd argue that the Look-See borrows just as much from characters like Freddy Krueger. Still though, he is a mostly faceless man in a suit that can teleport into surreality, but that's about where the comparisons end. Regardless, their connection is noticeable enough that it warranted including him in this video. Now I do want to give an honorable mention to Zolgo. He doesn't really share any direct connections to the Slender Man aside from the fact that they're both creepypasta monsters inspired by H.P. Lovecraft, but I thought it would just be weird not to mention him in this discussion. It's kinda like talking about Slender the 8 Pages without at least mentioning Amnesia or SCP Containment Breach. Before we go over this next one, I have to thank the YouTube channel Painicus for their videos on the history of both Slendrina and Granny. I never played these games growing up, so his content was incredibly useful while doing research for this video. Please check them out if you haven't already. Both Slendrina and Granny are part of a series of child-friendly Slender Man fan games produced by creator D.V. Loper. They're mobile games made for iOS and Android, and among all the Slender copycats, these are probably the most ambitious. The first Slendrina game was made back in 2013 during the tail end of the creepypasta phenomenon. Over the course of 4 years, D.V. Loper would release a total of 10 Slendrina games, with each subsequent entry experimenting with the previous game's formula. This would eventually come to a head with the release of Granny in November of 2017. To call this game popular would have been an understatement. While it never received the same level of attention as Slender or FNAF, it was just as popular as games like Hello Neighbor or Bendy and the Ink Machine. Everyone and their grandmother was playing this at the time, and Granny's gameplay formula arguably went on to inspire games like Amnesia the Bunker, which I personally find hysterical. Widely known yet often ridiculed, Granny along with the Slendrina series are without a doubt the most underrated inclusion in this video. It goes to show just how far Slender's reach extends once you begin to look at it. Much like Tiki Toby, this inclusion was sort of a no-brainer. Baldi's Basics is an indie horror game that draws much of its inspiration from the PC edutainment game Sonic's Schoolhouse. You play as a new student attending Baldi's school, and you're tasked with collecting 8 notebooks. While you're doing that, Baldi will begin to aggressively stalk you, and you'll have to run from him while navigating around other NPCs that can completely fuck up your run. The game's formula borrows the most from Slender Man's Shadow, right down to the escape sequence after collecting all the notebooks. However, it's clear that the game also borrows a fair amount from Five Nights at Freddy's. It's like the developer saw the music box minigame from FNAF 2 and thought to themselves, what if we had like 7 of those you had to manage? Where the fuck did that voice come from? All in all, Baldi's Basics is the most notable example of Slender's page collecting formula. The only reason it's scored lower than Slendrina on this list is because none of the Slender Man iconography is present at all. Otherwise, I would easily score it an 8. Okay, let me defend myself here. I'm sure this is probably the most unhinged take in the entire video, but think about it. Dead by Daylight involves a ton of players hiding from one individual killer, there's a series of different objectives that have to be completed in order to successfully escape, the killer has abilities that they can use to stop their victims, and the players hiding from the killer have to coordinate and work together in order to try and outsmart their enemy and escape. Now take all of that into consideration, and then look at Stop It Slender. I'm not saying they stole their idea. You can't prove to me that they didn't. This sounds like a random inclusion, but I think it's weird to do a video on Slender Man and his influence on horror without at least mentioning Outlast. It's clear that Red Barrels were drawing a lot of inspiration from the horror games that were popular at the time, and at the forefront was Slender, Amnesia: The Dark Descent, and SCP Containment Breach. I mean, hell, they literally cited Amnesia as one of their inspirations during an interview. What you have to understand is that Outlast's main goal was to try and perfect the run-and-hide horror game formula. When Penumbra came out, it was treated as a turning point in first-person horror games because it was the first time you couldn't fight back against the monsters. Now, this isn't exactly true. Pathologic came out in 2002 and it had an unreliable combat system that incentivized staying out of fights. But the point I'm trying to reach is that Penumbra motivated a lot of developers to experiment with this newfound formula. Outlast was sort of the moment where all these ideas coalesced into this single definitive experience. And while there's been other games that have evolved the style of horror, such as Alien Isolation, it's overall remembered as a game that was just great across the board. In other words, if Penumbra was the Mario 64 of this sort of horror game, then Outlast was like the Mario Galaxy of this genre, and Layers of Fear was like Bubsy 3D. Now personally, I don't think there's a connection between Slender and Outlast. The game draws most of its level design and narrative structure from Amnesia: The Dark Descent, although the map is far less interactive. If it does draw any inspiration from Slender and SCP, it's probably superficial. Found footage horror was a major inspiration for Red Barrels, so I wouldn't be shocked if they knew about Marble Hornets. And as for SCP Containment Breach, I wouldn't be surprised if it inspired the Insane Asylum setting, as well as all the experiments that were going on behind the scenes in the story. Regardless of whether or not there's a connection between Slender and Outlast, it without a doubt owes its success to the big three that preceded it, which is why it's here as an honorable mention. So, with all those out of the way, we'll now look at how these projects influence the realm of analog horror, starting with
Be not afraid, the Orbiters are one.
What can I even say about Local 58 that hasn't been said before? Local 58 began its life as a small trio of videos. Weather Service warned viewers of the dangers that came from looking at the moon. Contingency Plan explored leaked government instructions pertaining to a national Zeus pact. And You're on the Fastest Available Route revealed the final moments of a driver recorded through a dashcam video in 2014. The disjointed story coupled with the damaged analog aesthetic went a long ways to hiding the terror of these videos, and coupled with Chris Straub's unique style of horror, produced an experience that felt just as real as the creepypasta phenomenon that preceded it. This wasn't an accident either, as Straub was one of the key players during the height of creepypasta. This small set of videos would later grow in size and become one of the most defining horror series on YouTube, and much like Marble Hornets, it influenced just as many projects. So why is Local 58 in this section? Well, it's because Clearlix 44, along with other horror projects like Knock Plus 10 and Kryna Gershabov TV, were the first to pioneer this style of broadcast horror. Obviously, Chris Straub didn't set out to copy any of these series, but I would be shocked if he didn't look at what was going on in the online horror space while brainstorming his project. The fact remains that elements of Clearlix 44 are obviously present in the editing style of Local 58, and as nitpicky as it sounds, the DNA of Marble Hornets and its sequel can still be felt throughout a lot of the analog horror genre. However, something you'll notice is that the elements of Clearlix 44 present in these later works are a lot more diluted. To show you what I mean, we need to talk about Gemini Home Entertainment for a moment. Gemini Home Entertainment is by all accounts a Local 58 clone. We can agree with that, right? It follows the same sort of structure and aesthetic as Local 58. The network itself is both ominous and untrustworthy, and one of the antagonists is even a Lovecraftian celestial body. The thing is though, calling Gemini a Local 58 clone is kind of insulting because it's like calling Local 58 a Clearlix 44 clone. Not only does Remy Abode, the creator of Gemini, bring a lot of his own ideas to the table, but he also improved upon the Local 58 formula to such a degree that it genuinely feels like its own thing. So given that, it's no surprise that the elements of Clearlix 44 present in Gemini Home Entertainment are far more diluted than they were in Local 58. And this begs the question, at what point does the influence of a given work cease to be relevant in a discussion like this? Because otherwise we could trace all these projects back to War of the Worlds, and obviously that wasn't something that was going through the heads of most of these creators.
It's you! It's you!
Yeah. Well, yes, kind of.
How could you,
Yeah.
man?
Personally, I think it ties into the degree of separation. The reason I feel comfortable calling Baldi derivative Slender, for example, is because the gameplay loop is basically just a page collecting formula, but with added mechanics. The parallel between these two games is just incredibly noticeable. Likewise, I feel somewhat comfortable calling Local 58 derivative Clearlix 44, because Chris Straub was a prominent figure in the history of creepypasta. I mean, if someone like Alex Hall was aware of other creepypastas while working on Ben Drowned, then I have a hard time believing that Chris Straub wasn't following these projects as well. However, I just can't say the same about Gemini Home Entertainment. I just don't see much of Marble Hornets at all while watching this series. In fact, it's a lot more reminiscent of watching ghost caught on camera videos from the mid to late 2000s. The only major influences that I was able to pick up on while watching this was Local 58, Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Thing, and maybe a tinge of Petscop, which goes to show how original this series is. Like, I'm sure you could probably pick out far more influences if you sat down with the series long enough, but at a certain point it almost feels like cherry picking. So, given all of that, I couldn't justify Gemini's inclusion in this video beyond giving it an honorable mention. And the same is true for stuff like the Mandela Catalog, Kane Pixel's Backrooms, or even The Oldest View. Although that last one is pretty reminiscent of Marble Hornets. However, the same can't be said for Remy's other project, Morley Grove. Despite how diluted Marble Hornets' influence was on Gemini Home Entertainment, Morley Grove proves that the Slender Man character was still something Remy was fully aware of. But what I find even more impressive is that Morley Grove is an entirely new take on the character. Set in the early days of YouTube, this web series explores a paranormal phenomenon in the town of Morley Grove, Tennessee, known as the Morley Grove Specters. Children have been systematically going missing, and certain paranormal experts believe that an entity known as the Morley Man may be the blame. But even more jarring is that evidence of their existence has been slowly disappearing from not just the memories of family members, but also physical recordings such as videos and photos. Much like Gemini Home Entertainment, Morley Grove invokes the feeling of ghost caught on camera type videos that were prominent on the internet during the 2000s. Each shot of the Morley Man is one of those blink and you'll miss it sort of scenes, and the hallway footage triggered a fear in me that I hadn't felt since I was a kid surfing through videos in 2008. If you haven't seen this series, please check it out. It's without a doubt my favorite depiction of the Slender Man. Overall, Morley Grove manages to capture the spirit of the Marble Hornets craze without relying on any of the established tropes or iconography. It shows that there's still a desire to make meaningful art of this character, and that he's still beloved by the internet in spite of everything. And this brings us to the crux of this video. Why is this character important? Why do people on the internet cling so fervently to this faceless man? And why should we care about everything he went on to inspire? In order to answer that, we'll need to talk about...
Evan, look to the camera. There it is, nice. The face of an angel.
Are you shy on camera?
Yeah. It's just a businessman, dude. Just a tall business guy.
Coined as art for everyone by YouTuber Valeria Santiago, the Slenderverse consists of projects that are all directly inspired by the lore, ideas, or found footage aesthetic of Marble Hornets. Not all of these projects contain the Slender Man, and not all of them are tied to each other. The main commonality they share, though, is that they're all character-driven stories made on a shoestring budget. Projects like Everyman Hybrid, Dark Harvest, and Whispered Faith were each incredibly popular back when Marble Hornets was still fresh on everyone's minds. Hybrid follows the story of a group of friends whose daily health channel gets hijacked by paranormal forces beyond their control. Dark Harvest explores the idea of a dark cult that follows and worships the Slender Man, and Whispered Faith details the account of a man that's being stalked by the Rake. Oh god, I forgot to talk about the Rake! Fuck! Okay, I'm gonna have to save that for another video, I guess. However, for as much as I want to praise the Slenderverse for its inclusivity and low barrier of entry, it's certainly a movement that's past its prime. While doing research for this video, the only newer Slenderverse projects that really caught my eye were No Cameras and North Clear 30. However, most of these series look identical to one another. I think the reason for this is that the Slenderverse is stuck in the past, which is indicative of a major problem with the Slender Man character. He's become too defined. The reason why the Slender Man was such an iconic character to begin with, and why there's communities like the Slenderverse that cling so desperately to him, is because the Slender Man was a blank canvas. He could have meant whatever you wanted him to mean, and with that came a lot of artistic freedom and creative liberty. But on top of that, there also weren't any conventions for how to make a Slender Man project. Nobody knew what to do with him at the time, and because of that, people had to throw shit at the wall and see what stuck. That's why projects like Marble Hornets or Slender the 8 Pages felt so revolutionary. They were trying out things that hadn't been fully explored yet. Nobody had really done a found footage project on the same level as the Blair Witch until Marble Hornets, and Slender the 8 Pages tried to innovate the run and hide genre of horror games. On top of that, Clearlix44 was an early pioneer of not just analog horror, but also broadcast horror. But with all the copycats that spawned from the success of the Slender Man, fewer and fewer people dared to deviate from proven formulas. The character essentially has to be 10 feet tall or so. He has to have tentacles that spawn out of his back. He has to have a suit and tie. He has to corrupt video footage. His stories have to be shot on a camcorder. It has to feel like the Blair Witch, and on and on and on. If you really want to understand why the Slender Man and the Slenderverse aren't popular anymore, it's because the Slender Man became too formulaic. I'm not saying you can't tell a captivating story using this formula. Marble Hornets Rosswood is a perfect example of that. The point I'm trying to reach is that the Slenderverse as a whole has become incredibly stale. Like, take any of these series and put them next to Morley Grove. I'm not saying that this is where the future of the character lies, but it's clear at a glance that one of these has a clear direction and artistic vision. I get that there's an amount of luck that comes with blowing up on YouTube, but that's nothing but an excuse. You have to be willing to take risks with not just the character, but also the story and presentation if you want people to share your work. You have to be able to strike a chord in the people that view your work, and your passion for the art form has to be on full display. There's nothing wrong with making art for yourself, but if you ever want other people to enjoy your work, you have to be able to make art for them as well. And that more or less covers the cultural reach of the Slender Man. The rise and fall of this character is basically synonymous with the golden age of creepypasta, and once the Slender Man fell out of favor, we all knew that the movement was pretty much dead. However, considering we're in the middle of a creepypasta renaissance with projects like Ted's Caving Journal and Chainmail Chasers, one has to ask, is there still a future for the Slender Man? Well, I think there is, but it's not without a few caveats. Allow me to explain. In my Jeff the Killer retrospective, I showed how the character was a good template for beginner authors. When I wrote that video, not much had been done with old Jeffy Boy after the Banning K reboot outside of projects like the Morgue Files. And in that video, I pointed out that there was a lot of ideas that could still be done with the original Jeff the Killer character. However, the Slender Man character isn't that cut and dry, and this is due to the legacy that precedes him. People are inevitably going to compare your work to Marble Hornets if you don't do enough to stand out from the crowd. And with that comparison comes all the baggage and controversy that surrounds the original version of the Slender Man. Whether it's the litany of derivative works, the creepypasta fandom, the 2014 stabbing incident, or the 2018 film, all of that is going to be taken into account unless you make an effort to shake things up. The fact of the matter is that the next big Slender Man project will be born outside of the shadow of Marble Hornets. And Morley Grove basically proves my point here. It was the first time in about a decade that I and many others were excited about a Slender Man project. So that begs the question, what can be done to innovate on the Slender Man? The first thing you should try to do is alter the design somewhat, or at the very least, you should make the character hard to spot. Part of why the Morley Man was so creepy, for example, was because he literally blends in with the trees. You never really see what he looks like, he's just a silhouette of a man. But if you want the Slender Man to be visible, you could always try to change up his look. Maybe alter the color scheme a bit, perhaps ditch the tie, or maybe even throw in a trench coat or something. Hell, you could even give him a hat. It's not the first time he's worn one. Whatever decision you make with the character's design, it needs to tie into the themes of your story, and it needs to be scary. Secondly, I would consider moving away from the found footage format. Or at the very least, you need to go in with a very clear artistic vision if you're going to shoot a found footage series. You need to be willing to put in the work ethic, and you need to find a way to stand out. The reason that Marble Hornets and projects like Everyman Hybrid were as popular as they were was because they were pioneers in the realm of found footage and unfiction. A lot of the shit they were trying hadn't really been done before, and the work they did went on to inform future projects like the VHS films or Skinamarink. Finally, your story has to say something meaningful. It needs to have a clear set of themes that the story adheres to, and the viewer or reader needs to be able to walk away from your story with something meaningful. I understand this sort of thing is a lot more subdued in an amateur project like Marble Hornets, but even that story relies on themes like trust and recovery. My only advice is to consume and study other pieces of media, as well as read up on how to write themes and character arcs. It also wouldn't hurt to run your ideas by your peers. That sort of constructive feedback can go a long way in refining your story, and by running your ideas by other people, you can come away from a conversation with an even better idea than the one you originally had. I think if a Slender Man project can accomplish all three of these things and pave out a unique identity for itself, it'll have a good shot at being a major success. But hey, those are just my thoughts on what you could do with the Slender Man story. I mean, I could be wrong. It's possible that there may still be a large demand for this style of found footage horror. Regardless of whether I'm right, I do think it's only a matter of time before someone goes out of their way to revitalize the character. It already happened to Jeff the Killer, so it's not a matter of if, but when. And if this video ends up inspiring that author, just remember to include me in the special thanks section of your story. That's not a joke, by the way.
I will be lurking in your comments.
Happy Halloween!
Also, did I show you? Don't move from where you are, but Dokes is